The gates of Renholt had never closed on a queen before. Not in 300 years of history, not through wars, not through famine, not even when enemy armies camped beyond the river. But on the morning the guards would later refuse to speak of, they watched their own captain give an order that broke something inside every man who heard it. This is the story of the day loyalty and duty tore each other apart, and of the woman who walked out of her own home with her head still held high. The kingdom of Renholt had always measured its winters by how long the frost stayed on the palace windows. That year, the frost came early and did not leave. It settled over the stone towers in October and stayed through the funeral of King Alaric in November, as if the sky itself understood that something had ended. Queen Seraphine stood at the front of the great hall on the day they buried her husband, dressed in black wool that had been sewn overnight because no mourning dress in her closet was dark enough for a king. She did not cry in front of the court. She had learned long ago that a queen's grief belonged to her chambers, not to the eyes of nobles who watched for weakness the way wolves watched for a limp in the herd. Beside her stood her stepson, Prince Corin, 16 years old and now the king of Renholt in name only, since the law required a regent until his 18th birthday. And on her other side stood her own 2 children, Princess Leora, 12, with her father's dark eyes, and little Tobin, only 7, who kept asking when his father would wake up. Captain Elias Thorne stood at his post near the doors of the great hall, as he had stood at his post every single day for 11 years. He had guarded King Alaric since before the king had a beard worth combing. He had guarded Seraphine since the day she arrived in Renholt as a young bride from a smaller kingdom to the south, nervous and unsure of the customs, and he had watched her grow into a queen the people genuinely loved, not for her crown, but for the way she remembered the names of the servants' children and visited the sick wards without being asked. Elias did not know, standing there in the cold hall with his hand on his sword, that in less than 2 months he would be the man ordered to walk her out of the palace gates forever. The trouble began 3 days after the funeral, when Lord Cashin, the king's cousin and the man chosen by the old council to serve as regent until Corin came of age, called his first private meeting. He did not invite the queen. He did not invite Captain Thorne. He invited only the 6 lords who had quietly resented Seraphine's influence for years, men who had watched a foreign-born queen sit at the right hand of their king and never forgiven her for it, even though she had given the kingdom 2 more heirs, and had never once used her position for anything but kindness. The kingdom cannot be seen as weak, Lord Cashin said that night, his voice smooth as poured wax. A young king, a grieving widow with foreign blood, 2 small children with no true claim to succession. The border lords will smell opportunity in this. We must show strength. We must show that Renholt answers to Renholt blood alone. One of the older lords, a quiet man named Bertrand who had served 3 kings faithfully, frowned at this. The queen has done nothing but serve this kingdom for 15 years. The queen, Cashin said, is not the problem. The queen's presence is. As long as she remains in the palace with her children, whispers will grow that she seeks to place her own blood on the throne instead of Corin's. It does not matter if it is true. It only matters what the border kingdoms believe. It was a lie built cleverly enough to sound like wisdom, and that was the most dangerous kind of lie there was. By the end of that meeting, 5 of the 6 lords had agreed. The 6th, Lord Bertrand, left the room troubled, but he was outnumbered, and in the world of politics, being outnumbered was often the same as being wrong. Captain Thorne heard about the meeting from a serving girl 2 days later, the way most palace secrets traveled, through the people who cleaned the rooms and carried the wine, who were invisible to the lords but heard everything. He did not believe it at first. It seemed impossible that anyone would try to remove a queen who had brought nothing but grace to the kingdom. He went to Lord Cashin directly, because 11 years of service had taught him that the direct path was usually the wisest one. "My lord," Elias said, standing straight in the regent's study, "there are rumors that the queen and her children may be asked to leave the palace. I would like to know if these rumors carry any truth." Cashin did not look up from the papers on his desk immediately. When he finally did, his eyes were calm in a way that made the hair on Elias' arms rise. "You are a good captain, Thorne, loyal. The king trusted you completely, and I intend to keep you in your post." He paused. "But you would do well to remember that your oath is to the crown of Renholt, not to any single person who wears it. The crown now sits in truth in this office until Corin is of age. I would advise you not to concern yourself with matters above a captain's station." It was not a denial, it was a warning. Elias left that room with his jaw tight and his hands curled into fists at his sides. And for the first time in 11 years of service, he understood that keeping his oath and protecting the people he loved might not be the same thing anymore. That night he could not sleep. He walked the palace corridors long after the torches had been lowered, past the nursery where Tobin slept with a small wooden horse clutched in his fist, past Leora's room where a single candle still burned because the girl had been afraid of the dark since her father's death. He stood outside the Queen's chamber for a long moment, listening to nothing, and finally walked away without knocking, because he did not yet know what he would say to her, and a captain who could offer no solution had no right to disturb a grieving mother's rest. Word of the council's decision did not come formally for another 3 weeks. Renholt's political machine moved slowly and carefully, the way a spider moves when it does not want to disturb the fly still caught at the edge of its web. In that time, Seraphine noticed small changes that told her everything the lords would not say to her face. Her monthly allowance for the children's tutors was quietly reduced, with a note claiming budget concerns during the mourning period. 2 of her longest-serving ladies-in-waiting were reassigned to other duties without explanation. Invitations to council meetings, which she had always attended as the king's widow and mother of the young king's siblings, simply stopped arriving. She said nothing publicly. She had survived 15 years in a royal court by understanding that a queen who showed panic gave her enemies exactly the weapon they wanted. But in the privacy of her chamber, she began quietly packing a single trunk with the things that mattered most: a portrait of Alaric from their wedding day, Tobin's first pair of shoes, a small leather book of poems Leora had written for her father's birthday and never got to give him. She was preparing for something she refused to name out loud, because naming it would make it real. Captain Thorne noticed the trunk when he came to check on the evening guard rotation outside her chambers, as he did every night. He saw it through the half-open door and felt something in his chest crack quietly, like ice under weight it was never meant to hold. "Your Grace," he said softly, because even after everything, he still used her old title from before she was crowned, a small habit of respect between them that had started when she was young and frightened, and he was the only guard who spoke to her without flattery. "You know something." Seraphine turned from the trunk, and for the first time since the funeral, Elias saw the exhaustion she had been hiding from the entire court. Not weakness, exhaustion. The particular tiredness of a woman who had been strong for everyone else for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to let someone else carry the weight. "I know enough," she said quietly. "I have lived in courts long enough to read the wind before the storm arrives, Captain. Lord Cashin does not want me here. He never has. And now that Alaric cannot protect me, he no longer has to pretend otherwise. They cannot simply remove a queen from her own home." "They can do whatever they convince enough lords to agree to," Seraphine said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired, ancient understanding of how power actually worked, learned the hard way. "I am not the king's blood. Corin is young and grieving, and does not yet have the strength to stand against his own council. My children have no true claim that threatens anyone, but fear does not need logic, Captain. It only needs a story, and Cashin has built himself a very convincing one." Elias wanted to tell her it would not happen. He wanted to promise her, the way he had promised King Alaric on his deathbed, that he would protect this family with his life. But 11 years of service had also taught him not to make promises he might not have the power to keep, and so he said the only true thing he had. "Whatever happens, Your Grace, I will not let you walk through those gates without every ounce of dignity this kingdom owes you." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, and something in her tired eyes softened just slightly. "That," she said, "may be the only promise anyone in this palace can still keep." 3 days later, the formal notice arrived, sealed with the regent's own wax stamp, delivered not by a servant but by 2 of Cashin's personal guards, as if even the delivery of the letter needed to carry a message of its own. Seraphine read it standing in her chamber with Leora and Tobin playing nearby unaware, and she did not let her hands shake until she had folded the letter closed again. The notice was polite in its language and merciless in its meaning. For the security and stability of the crown during the young king's minority, the Dowager Queen and her children would relocate to Ashmere Manor, a smaller estate 2 days' ride from the capital, effective within the fortnight. It was, The letter insisted, a matter of protocol, not punishment. It was, everyone who read between the lines understood, an exile with better furniture. Seraphine did not cry that night either. She sat by the window long after her children had fallen asleep, watching the frost thicken on the glass, and thought about the girl she had been 15 years ago, arriving in this kingdom knowing no one, terrified and determined, and wondered if that girl would recognize the woman she had become, or if she would simply weep for everything that girl had not yet learned to survive. Outside her door, Captain Elias Thorne stood at his post as he always had, but for the first time, he found himself wondering whether standing at his post was still the same thing as protecting her. The fortnight had begun, and neither the Queen nor her captain yet knew just how painful its ending would be. The letter said protocol. The guards who read it in silence knew better. What followed over the next 2 weeks would test every man in the royal guard, and reveal exactly how far a desperate regent was willing to go to erase a queen quietly, without ever admitting what he was truly doing. News of the Queen's coming departure did not stay secret for long. Palace walls had never been good at holding secrets, and within 4 days, the kitchens knew, the stables knew, and the market outside the palace gates had begun to whisper about it over baskets of bread and barrels of salted fish. The people of Renholt had loved Seraphine since the early years of her marriage, when she had opened the palace gardens to the public during the harvest festival, and had personally funded a healer's house in the poorer quarter of the capital after a fever swept through and killed a dozen children in a single winter. She was not simply tolerated as a foreign-born queen. She was, to most common people, one of the few nobles who had ever treated them like they mattered. So when the rumor spread that Lord Cashin intended to send her away, the mood in the capital shifted from grief over the king's death to something sharper, a quiet, simmering anger that had nowhere yet to go. Lord Cashin felt that anger even through the palace walls, and it worried him more than he let his council see. He summoned Captain Thorne to his study on the 5th day after the notice was delivered, and this time his voice carried none of the smooth patience it had before. "The people are talking," Cashin said. "I want the departure handled quietly, no announcements, no public procession. She leaves through the eastern gate at dawn with minimal guard and no fanfare. Do you understand me, Captain?" "The eastern gate is the servants' gate, my lord." "I am aware of what it is." Elias felt his jaw tighten, the same way it had in that first meeting weeks ago. The Queen Consort of Renholt has never once left this palace through a servant's entrance, not even in disgrace, not even in war. "She is not being sent away in disgrace," Cashin said, his voice sharpening. "She is relocating for the security of the crown. But I will not have half the capital gathered at the main gate weeping over a woman who is not even losing her life, only her address. Quiet. Dawn. Eastern gate. See that it is done, Captain, or I will find a captain who will." The threat sat plainly on the table between them, and Elias understood with a cold clarity exactly what kind of man he was now serving. Not a king. Not even a fair regent. A man frightened enough of a grieving widow's popularity that he would strip her of dignity itself rather than risk the sight of common people mourning her exit. Elias did not argue further in that room. He had learned long ago that some battles could not be won by shouting, only by choosing the moment carefully. He bowed, left the study, and walked straight to the barracks, where he gathered the 6 guards he trusted most in the entire regiment, men who had served the royal family for years, men who remembered Seraphine's kindness personally, not just as a rumor passed down from the older staff. "I cannot stop what is happening," he told them plainly, standing in the cold stone room where they had all slept for years. "I do not have that power, but I can decide how it happens, and I will not let the woman who fed half this city during the fever winter walk out of her own home like a criminal being smuggled away in the dark." The 6 guards looked at each other, and one by one they nodded. Not because Elias commanded them to, because they wanted to. Word of the coming departure reached young King Corin 2 days before it was to happen, and the 16-year-old boy, still raw with grief over his father, did something none of the lords expected. He went to Lord Cashin's study himself, without an appointment, without his regent's permission, and demanded the order be reversed. "She is my mother in every way that matters," Corin said, his voice cracking with the particular anger of a boy who has just learned that being a king means very little when the crown sits on someone else's authority. "She raised me since I was a child. My father loved her. I will not allow her to be thrown out of my own house." Cashin's expression did not change. He had prepared for this conversation the moment the notice was sent. "Your Majesty," he said, using the title with a coldness that made it sound almost like an insult, "you are not yet of age. Until your 18th birthday, the decisions of this council stand as law regardless of your personal feelings. I understand this is difficult. Grief clouds judgment. But the security of Renholt cannot be decided by a boy's attachment to his stepmother, however genuine that attachment may be. She is not just my stepmother, she is the queen." "She was the queen," Cashin said quietly. "She is now the widow of a king with no blood claim of her own, and 2 children whose presence in this palace grows more politically inconvenient by the day. I am sorry if that truth is unkind, Your Majesty." "It does not make it less true." Corin left that study shaking with a fury he had never felt before in his life, a fury made worse by the fact that he had no actual power to stop what was coming. He went straight to Seraphine's chambers that night and found her calmly folding Tobin's small shirts into a trunk, her face composed in the same steady way it had been since the funeral. "I tried," Corin said, his voice breaking. "I went to him myself. I told him he couldn't do this. He didn't even—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, his shoulders shaking with the effort of not crying in front of her. Seraphine set down the shirt she was holding and crossed the room to him, pulling her stepson into her arms the way she had done 1,000 times since he was a small boy frightened of thunderstorms. "You tried," she said softly, "and that is more than most grown men in this palace have done. Do not carry guilt for a battle that was never yours to win alone, Corin. You are still a boy in the eyes of this council, however much a king you already are in my heart." "It isn't fair." "No," Seraphine agreed. "It is not. But I did not survive 15 years in this court by expecting fairness, my darling. I survived by refusing to let unfairness break me, and I need you to promise me something." Corin looked up at her, his eyes red. "When you are king in truth, and not just in name, remember this feeling. Remember exactly how it feels to watch power be used cruelly by men who call it necessity. And when your day comes, be a different kind of king than the one this council is teaching you to become." Corin promised, though neither of them yet knew how long it would take for that promise to matter, or what it would eventually cost him to keep it. The night before the departure, Captain Thorne made a decision that could have ended his career, and very nearly his life. He went, without permission, to Lord Bertrand, the one council member who had objected, quietly, to the entire plan from the beginning. "My lord," Elia said, finding the older lord alone in the palace library, "I know you did not agree with this. I know your voice was outnumbered in that room. I am not asking you to fight Lord Cashin tonight. I am asking you to simply be present tomorrow morning." Bertrand studied the captain for a long moment. "Present for what exactly, Captain?" "The regent has ordered the queen out through the servants' gate, at dawn, quietly, as if she were being smuggled away in shame. I intend to see that she leaves with the dignity this kingdom owes her instead. I cannot promise you this will be comfortable to witness. I can promise you it will be right." Bertrand was quiet for a long moment, his old eyes tired in the candlelight. Then he nodded slowly. "I served 3 kings in this palace, Captain, and I watched this kingdom grow soft with fear under lesser men before. I will be there. And I imagine I will not be the only lord who remembers what honor once looked like in this court." Elias left the library that night with something he had not expected to find: hope, small and fragile, but real. That same night, Seraphine sat with her 2 children in the nursery for the last time, telling them, in the gentle voice she had always used to soften hard truths, that tomorrow they would begin a new adventure, a smaller castle, a quieter life, closer to the hills Tobin had always loved. She did not tell them the real reason. Some truths were not meant for a 7-year-old and a 12-year-old to carry, not yet, not when their mother could still carry it for them a little longer. But Leora, sharper than her years, watched her mother's face carefully as she spoke, and later that night, when Tobin had finally fallen asleep, she crept to her mother's room and asked the question Seraphine had been dreading. "They're making us leave, aren't they? Because Papa is gone and we don't matter to them anymore." Seraphine sat down slowly on the edge of her daughter's bed and took her hands. "You matter," she said fiercely, more fiercely than she had said anything in weeks. "You matter to me more than this entire kingdom, more than any crown, more than any palace with cold stone floors and colder hearts. Some people in this world will try to measure your worth by how much power you hold. Never let them teach you to measure it that way yourself." Leora nodded, though tears finally slipped down her face, the first tears either of them had allowed themselves since the king's death. Seraphine held her daughter until she fell asleep, and then sat alone by the window until the frost on the glass began to catch the first gray light of the dawn that would change everything. Somewhere below in the barracks, Captain Elias Thorne had not slept either. He stood in the dark, fully dressed in his captain's uniform, polished as though for a coronation rather than an exile, and waited for the sky to lighten, knowing that whatever happened at the gates that morning would follow him for the rest of his life, one way or the other. Dawn came to Renholt that morning like a held breath finally released. And when the palace gates finally opened, what happened next was not what Lord Cashin had planned, not what the frightened council expected, and not something any guard standing in that courtyard would ever forget for the rest of his life. Captain Thorne had given his orders the night before, quietly, one guard at a time, so that no single conversation could be reported back to Cashin's spies before morning. He had not disobeyed the regent's command outright. That would have meant immediate removal from his post, and a captain removed from his post could protect no one. Instead, he had done something more careful. He had followed the letter of the order while rebuilding its spirit entirely. The Queen would leave through the eastern gate, exactly as commanded. But the eastern gate, that morning, would not look like the servants' entrance it had always been. By the time the first gray light touched the palace towers, Elias had positioned 2 full rows of the royal guard in their finest ceremonial armor along the eastern courtyard, standing at full attention, as though welcoming a foreign king rather than quietly escorting a widow into exile. He had asked 6 of the palace's oldest servants, people who had known Seraphine since her arrival as a young bride, to stand near the gate with simple bundles of winter flowers, the only bloom hardy enough to survive the frost, because a queen leaving her home, he had decided, would not leave without a single flower to mark the day. And standing near the gate itself, wrapped in his heaviest winter cloak against the early cold, was Lord Bertrand, along with 3 other council members he had quietly spoken to in the 2 days prior, men who, once reminded plainly of what kind of departure was being planned, found they did not want their names attached to it either. Lord Cashin arrived at the courtyard expecting silence and found instead a small, dignified crowd, and his face, for the first time in weeks, showed something other than calm control. "Captain," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "I gave clear instructions." "You ordered the Queen to leave through the eastern gate at dawn, my lord," Elias replied evenly, not breaking his straight posture. "I have followed that order exactly. You know this is not what I meant." "You did not specify the manner, my lord, only the gate and the hour." Elias' eyes did not waver. "I have given you both." Cashin's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he might order the guards dispersed by force, might create the exact public scene he had been so desperate to avoid. But even he understood, standing there in that courtyard with 4 council members already present as witnesses, that punishing a captain for arranging a dignified farewell would look far worse than simply allowing it to happen. He said nothing further. He simply stepped back, his fury folded carefully behind a mask of practiced patience, and let the morning continue. Seraphine emerged from the palace doors at the appointed hour, dressed simply but elegantly, with Leora holding Tobin's hand on one side of her, and a single trunk carried behind them by 2 servants who had asked, specifically, for the honor of carrying it themselves. She had expected the servants' gate. She had expected quiet, and shame dressed up as protocol, and she had spent the entire night preparing her heart to survive it without breaking in front of her children. She was not prepared for what she saw instead. 2 rows of guards in ceremonial armor, standing at attention. Old faces she recognized from 15 years of small kindnesses, holding winter flowers with hands that trembled slightly from cold or emotion or both. Lord Bertrand, standing with 3 other lords, bowing to her, actually bowing, the formal bow reserved for a reigning queen, not the polite nod one might offer a dismissed widow. And at the head of it all, Captain Elias Thorne, standing exactly where he always stood, sword at his side, back straight, offering her the same formal salute he had offered every single morning for 11 years, as though this were any ordinary day and she were still, in every way that mattered, his queen. Seraphine stopped walking. For the first time since the king's death in front of the entire courtyard, her composure finally broke, just slightly, not into sobbing, but into a single, unguarded breath that carried 15 years of grief and gratitude and grief again, all at once. "Captain," she said quietly, when she had gathered herself enough to speak, "you did not have to do this. You risk everything you have built here." "Your Grace," Elias said, his own voice unsteady in a way it had never been in 11 years of service, "I have spent my entire career protecting this family. I could not protect you from the decision that was made. But I could make certain the entire kingdom understood what kind of woman was leaving it, and what kind of men allowed it to happen." Behind her, young King Corin appeared in the doorway, still in his sleeping clothes, having heard the commotion and run from his chambers without waiting to dress properly. He crossed the courtyard in front of the entire assembled guard, in front of Cashin himself, and embraced his stepmother in full view of everyone, holding her the way a son holds a mother he is terrified of losing. "I will fix this," he whispered fiercely into her shoulder. "When I'm king in truth, I will bring you home myself, I swear it." "I know you will," Seraphine whispered back, "and I will be waiting however long it takes." Tobin, too young to fully understand what was happening but old enough to feel the weight of the moment in the silence around him, began to cry, and it was Leora, 12 years old and trying desperately to be brave for her little brother, who knelt down and wiped his tears and told him, in a voice that shook only slightly, that they were simply going on an adventure, and adventures always felt scary right before they became wonderful. The old servants stepped forward one by one and pressed their small bundles of winter flowers into Seraphine's arms until she was holding more blooms than her trunk could carry, and each one whispered some small memory as they did. The healer's house she had funded, the harvest festival she had opened to the poor, the letter she had once written personally to a dying kitchen maid's family. 15 years of quiet kindness returned to her all at once in a single courtyard on the coldest morning of the year. Lord Cashin watched all of this from the edge of the courtyard, his face unreadable, and though he said nothing, several of the lords who witnessed that morning would later remark that something in his authority had quietly cracked that day, even if the crack would take years to fully show. When it was finally time, Seraphine turned to Captain Thorne one last time before stepping through the gate. "Will you watch over him?" she asked, meaning Corin, meaning the palace, meaning everything she was leaving behind that she could no longer protect herself. "Until my last breath, Your Grace," Elias said. "That is a promise I intend to keep for as long as I am able." She nodded, and for just a moment, something passed between them that neither had ever spoken aloud in 11 years. Not romance, but something deeper and quieter, the particular bond between two people who had spent over a decade protecting the same fragile, complicated family, each in their own way. Then she took her children's hands and walked through the eastern gate of Renholt Palace, not through a servant's entrance in shameful silence, but past 2 rows of saluting guards, past bowing lords, past old friends holding winter flowers, with her head held high and her dignity fully intact, exactly as Captain Thorne had promised her weeks before in the quiet of her chamber. The gate closed behind her with a sound that echoed across the courtyard like the final note of a long, sad song. But it was not, as Cashin had hoped, the sound of an ending. It was, though no one in that courtyard yet fully understood it, only the sound of a much longer story beginning. Weeks passed at Ashmere Manor, and the kingdom believed the story had quietly ended the moment the gates closed behind her. It had not. What began in that courtyard would take nearly 2 years to fully unfold, and when it finally did, it would remind every lord in Renholt exactly why a kingdom should never mistake kindness for weakness. Ashmere Manor sat at the edge of a wide valley, 2 days' ride from the capital, smaller than the palace in every way except one. It was quiet in a manner the palace had never been, free of whispering corridors and watching eyes. Seraphine had expected to grieve there, and she did, but she had not expected to also find, slowly and unwillingly at first, a kind of peace. The local people did not know her as a dismissed queen. They knew her only as the kind widow who had moved into the old manor with her 2 children, a woman who, within her first month, had reopened the small village school that had closed years earlier for lack of funding, and who visited the sick with the same quiet devotion she had once shown in the capital. Word of her kindness traveled slower out here, without the palace's gossiping corridors to carry it, but it traveled all the same, carried instead by grateful mothers and healed children and a village that had never expected a queen in exile to care about them at all. Leora grew steadier with each passing month, finding a strange comfort in the manor's simplicity, though she never stopped asking quietly when they might see Corin again. Tobin, resilient in the particular way small children often are, adjusted faster than either his mother or sister, finding joy in the hills he had always loved, running through fields with a freedom the palace had never allowed him. But Seraphine herself carried a quiet ache that never fully left her, not for the palace itself, and not even for the titles she had lost, but for the people she had left behind, for Corin, growing into kingship alone under a regent who saw him as an obstacle to be managed rather than a boy to be guided, and for Captain Thorne, whom she thought of more often than she admitted even to herself, wondering whether his defiance that morning had cost him more than she would ever know. It had, though he never once regretted it. Lord Cashin did not punish Elias openly, understanding that removing a captain so beloved by both the guard and the common people would only confirm every unflattering rumor already spreading about him. Instead, his punishment was quieter, and in some ways crueler. Elias found himself slowly stripped of meaningful duties, reassigned from the young king's personal guard to overseeing the outer palace walls, a demotion dressed up as reorganization. He accepted it without complaint, because he had known the cost the moment he lined those guards up in the courtyard, and he had decided, long before dawn broke that morning, that the cost was worth paying. What Cashin had not accounted for was Corin. The young king, still bound by law to the council's authority until his 18th birthday, spent the following 2 years doing something none of the lords expected from a grieving boy. He watched, and he learned, and he waited with a patience that surprised even Lord Bertrand, who had quietly become something of a mentor to him in the months following Seraphine's departure. Corin attended every council meeting he was permitted to attend. He asked careful questions. He built quiet alliances with the lords who had never fully trusted Cashin's ambition, including Bertrand and the 3 others who had stood in that courtyard on the morning of the Queen's departure. He learned, piece by piece, exactly how Cashin had manipulated the council in those first grief-stricken weeks after his father's death, exploiting fear and confusion before anyone had the strength to question him properly. And on the morning of his 18th birthday, in a ceremony the entire capital turned out to witness, Corin was crowned King of Renholt in full and complete authority. The regency formally ended, and Lord Cashin's carefully built power dissolved in a single afternoon. Corin's first official act as king, before the crowd had even finished cheering, was to summon Captain Elias Thorne to the front of the ceremony and restore him publicly to the head of the royal guard. Praising him by name for a courage the young king said he would never forget as long as he lived. The crowd, many of whom remembered that cold morning at the eastern gate, erupted into an approval louder than anything heard at the ceremony before it. His second act, announced the very same day, was the formal recall of the Dowager Queen Seraphine and her children to the palace, not as exiles returning quietly, but as family being welcomed home with the full honor the kingdom had denied them 2 years before. The letter that reached Ashmere Manor a week later was written in Corin's own hand, not a formal court decree but a personal, imperfect letter full of a young man's overflowing feelings, and Seraphine read it standing in the same window where she had once watched frost thicken on the glass, tears finally falling freely for the first time in 2 years, not from grief this time, but from something that felt, after so long, almost like relief. The journey back to the capital took 2 days, the same 2 days it had taken to leave, but the road felt entirely different traveled in the opposite direction. When their carriage finally approached the palace gates, Seraphine found herself holding her breath, unsure what to expect after so long away. She should not have worried. The eastern gate stood open, and beyond it the courtyard was filled, not just with guards in ceremonial armor, though they stood there too, Captain Thorne once again at their head, but with what seemed like half the capital, common people who had heard the news and gathered simply to see the kind queen come home. Flowers lined the courtyard, not the small, hardy winter blooms of 2 years before, but full spring flowers in every color the season could offer, as if the kingdom itself had waited until it could give her a proper welcome. Corin stood waiting at the top of the palace steps, no longer the grieving 16-year-old boy who had embraced her in that courtyard 2 years before, but a young king in full command of himself. And yet the moment he saw her step down from the carriage, all of that composure fell away, and he ran down the steps the way he had run to her 1,000 times as a child, pulling her into an embrace in front of the entire gathered crowd. "I told you I would fix it," he whispered. I never doubted you, Seraphine whispered back, though in truth, in her most exhausted moments at Ashmere, she sometimes had. She simply never told him so. Captain Thorne approached last, once the king had finally released her, and offered the same formal salute he always had, though this time his composure cracked slightly at the corners, a small, unguarded smile breaking through 11, now 13 years of careful discipline. Welcome home, Your Grace, he said simply. Thanks to you, Captain, Seraphine replied. I always knew I still had one. Lord Cashin did not remain in the capital long after the coronation. Stripped of his regency and facing a council no longer willing to protect him, he retreated quietly to his family's distant estate. His ambitions ended not by violence or revenge, but by something he had never accounted for, a boy he underestimated, growing into a king who remembered every lesson his stepmother had ever taught him about the difference between power and honor. In the years that followed, the story of the morning Captain Thorne lined the eastern gate with saluting guards became something of a quiet legend among the people of Renholt, told not as a tale of politics or power, but as a simple story about loyalty, about a captain who found a way to keep his oath and his conscience both intact, and about a queen who walked out of her own exile with more dignity than the men who exiled her ever managed to hold onto themselves. Seraphine never forgot that morning either, not the cold, not the fear, not the flowers pressed into her arms by trembling, familiar hands. In her later years, when she told the story to her grandchildren, she did not dwell on Lord Cashin's cruelty or the 2 years spent away from home. She dwelled instead on the guards who had stood at attention in the frozen courtyard at dawn, on the old servants who found the courage to bow to a queen everyone else had been told to forget, and on the captain who had decided, in the quiet hours before sunrise, that some orders could be followed to the letter while still being entirely, defiantly disobeyed in spirit. It was, she always said, the truest lesson her time in Renholt ever taught her. That dignity was never something a crown gave a person, and never something a council could take away. It lived somewhere else entirely, in the small, quiet choices people made when no one was forcing them to make them at all.